The British Social Attitude Survey is in its 41st year. It asks a number of questions. One of the questions that it asks is, are you proud or very proud of Britain's history? And you know what? It's really extraordinary. In 2013, the answer to that was 86% said yes, they were proud or very proud of Britain's history. That figure has now collapsed down into the mid-60s, but most interestingly, amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds, that number is down below 40%. Something very big has shifted. Now, I would accept that there is a degree of generational change. You know, go back 10, 20 years, and people would say, well, you know what? You know, my dad was in the war, my mum worked in a factory making Lancasters, and maybe some of that link has gone. And I think we have to accept that. However, you know, I have been railing about this. We have got an educational establishment that goes right the way through primary school, secondary school, university, that seems to somehow rejoice in talking down Britain's past. You would have thought we were the only country in the history of mankind that had ever conducted slavery, far from being the one nation, actually, that ended it and lost a lot of money and a lot of lives driving it out. You would think the British Empire was the worst empire that had existed in the history of mankind. And yet it's the only empire ever created that now has a club of former members called the Commonwealth. And I think that is what is going on. I put it to you, Lloyd Brossenwell, that actually a sort of a Marxist takeover of people who hate the country, hate what it stands for, and they've done their job.
Well, first of all, it's not the only club. There's the organisation Francophonie as well, and there are other clubs of those former colonial powers. But I do think that we have got something wrong, but I'm not sure it's Marxist teaching. I think it's nuanced teaching is very difficult. People are being taught to find the right or wrong answer, and sometimes there is no right or wrong in the world. There is just what happened in the past, and we can't put moral judgments on these things. And I think
but we are doing that.
Well, I do agree that we have strayed into that situation. I also think that the timing of the last poll was very interesting. It was straight after the Olympics, and I think the Olympics in London 2012 really did bring together a feeling of Britishness. And that opening ceremony, to me, summarised the very best of Britain. It showed Windrush, it showed slavery and the fight for votes for women, but it also showed our humour and our comedy and our, you know, kind of, and our music and our cultural talents. And that's, I think, what we should be teaching. That Britain is not just flag-waving Second World War. There is a plethora of history there, some good, some bad, but all that we should understand and kind of respect.
2013 at 86% was a high point, although the previous decades were well in the 80s. The other thing, John Redwood, that is going on is there's a pretty big collapse in support and belief in our basic fundamental democratic system, our constitutional monarchy. I mean, you know, I just feel that we ought to be teaching people that this little speck on the map actually achieved quite remarkable things.
No, I agree with that, and I think it's very depressing how distorted history is now. Of course, there were some bad bits, but they seem to be the only things we concentrate on and constantly apologise for. And all the great things that our country can be rightly proud of get written out of the story or in some way damaged. When did we last hear about the huge technological advances that are sometimes called the Industrial Revolution, which then enable many other countries to get more people out of poverty and to create great cities and great industries? When do we hear about that continuous golden thread of progress from tyranny and aristocracy governing everybody to popular votes and to popular engagement and public opinion playing a very important part in debate and policy formation? When do we hear about the contributions we've made globally by often intervening in wars on the sides of those that want self-determination of smaller countries, that want greater freedom for peoples, that stand up to big tyrannies? And above all, as you rightly say, something we should be enormously proud of is our parents and grandparents who took on the Hitler genocide against the Jews and all the nasty features of the Nazi regime on our own for a bit before America came in, completely against the odds. Yeah.
I'm also worried, Lloyd, you know, only 53% now across the board, let alone the younger generation, where the figures are even worse, say they take pride in the way Britain's democracy works. And when you think, we can argue about governments and how good or bad they are, but you compare us to most countries around the world, the fact that the figure's as low as that, I find that very worrying.
Yes, I think that there is all countries, all democratic countries, need something to bond, need a national myth, as it were. America has this kind of American dream as their national myth. Britain, we have kind of developed a national myth of standing apart, standing strong. You know, kind of in the Second World War, even though we were alone, we stood apart, you know, kind of, and that has kind of been a narrative, you know, part of Europe, but on the edge of, you know, kind of all that narrative.
British exceptionalism.
And, yes, British exceptionalism. And the French have it the same, the resistance, and, you know, kind of, even though it's probably not historically true. The problem I think we have now in Britain, and in lots of Western world, actually, because those figures of collapse of democracy you'll see in all of European countries, actually, is that those myths were based, or those stories, not necessarily the myths, but those stories and those narratives were based on things that happened almost 80 years ago now. And people need to find the new relevance for them.
Yeah.
Now, I think there are elements of that, but someone needs to weave that together. And we need a national curriculum that says this is the modern version of what we had in the past.
But our governmental system...
Yeah.
You know, the constitutional monarchy, the things that were established, you know, way back in the 17th century, have, for all their faults, given us relative stability. We ought to be proud of that.
Yes, but there has also been real upturns and downturns in public opinion. During Victoria's latter part of her reign, it was the highest number of people who wanted to turn into a republic, much higher than we have now, for example.
Yes,
so I think sometimes we catastrophise these public opinions. They go up and down as the mood of the country goes up and down. But I think that as we start to move into a country where we are less worried about money, troubles and austerity and COVID, that have all been difficult things in the last few years, and move to a more hopeful period, then we can start to be more happy about ourselves.
One little celebration every year is the proms. It's always, of course, got its own little bit of controversy, but the fact that the proms host, Katie Dearham, has done it for 15 years, is now telling us the lyrics to Rule Britannia are incredibly problematic. I mean, goodness gracious me, can't we have a bit of fun?
And actually, what bit is problematic?
Well, you see, the fact that it refers to empire, that's what she's really going... But if you actually look at the lyrics of it, it's all about doing down tyrants. It's about liberty. It's about freedom.
But it is about victory as well.
Well, it's about us ruling the waves, which undoubtedly we did for centuries.
Yes.
And every country needs patriotic songs, and we can have new ones as well. 3 Lions on a Shirt is a new patriotic song.
So you're behind Rule Britannia.
I think you need patriotic songs, and they are parts of history that you should not be writing off.
You don't rewrite them. They are what they are.
What they are.
Doesn't mean that you don't also create new and also celebrate those new songs.
You have different thoughts about them from when they were originally written, but you can't rewrite the past that and get away with it.
You could knock me down with a feather. Lefty Lloyd likes Rule Britannia. On that note, we'll have to take a break. And 10 million pensioners are going to lose £200 a year, in some cases £300 a year. Unless, of course, they can claim benefits for which they have to fill in a 243-question form. So 10 million are going to lose out. And one of the big arguments has been, should there be a vote on this in the House of Commons or not? Well, John Healey was sent out this morning, the Defence Secretary, to defend the government as being, I think, one of their more competent media performers. And here he was, on with our friends at the BBC this morning.
Decision to scrap the winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners. We understand there's still no plan to have a vote on that, a debate on that in the House of Commons. Why not?
What you'll see next month when the Chancellor introduces the budget, you'll see votes in the normal way then. That'll be an opportunity for the House of Commons to vote on a range of measures that the government will have to take.
Now, John Redwood spent a considerable number of years in the House of Commons and understands how it all works. So the idea was they were going to make this change, quite a fundamental change to 10 million people, I mean, quite big stuff, without a vote, using statutory instruments. What were they planning to do, and how could they do that?
Well, if that's what they were planning, a statutory instrument is a sort of mini-law under an Act of Parliament which has been through a proper process. And Parliament does those in one of two ways. They either have a debate, a short debate on the statutory instrument modification of the law, and a simple vote. and it goes through because the government's got a majority.
Yep.
Or sometimes they get away with laying a statutory instrument which automatically becomes law, and the only right that the opposition have is to do something called praying against it, which means you kick up a fuss and say you can't do this, and then at a later date the government has to bring it for a debate and a vote. And if that's what they were trying, that is very sneaky on something of this salience, where a lot of Labour MPs want to express their views on it, let alone the opposition.
Well, put yourself, Lloyd, imagine that you were still there, you know, and you would have had a number of, you know, significant number of pensioners getting this. What would you be thinking right now?
Well, I think I would have preferred them to have done it in a slightly different way. I think you could have...
But they haven't.
You could have taxed in a different way to include winter fuel payments in tax payments and thresholds. They haven't. And so I think that, therefore, you are lumbered with it. Now, whether it's a positive or a negative, the statutory instrument that we've just heard, is laid out in the initial legislation. So it's not the government just choosing what shall we try and get away with today. It will say, if you want to modify winter fuel payments, brought in by Gordon Brown, of course, winter fuel payments requirements, you have to do it via either the positive or the negative. It will have said then in the law it can be changed with the negative. That just means that the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi or whoever it will be, needs to lay down that note complaining about it and get most of their backbenchers and most of their frontbenchers to sign it, and then there will be a vote. That's how these things work. So I am confident there will be a vote, and there are places
and there should be a vote.
And there should be a vote. And there are places to... But it wasn't the government's choosing to not have the vote in that way. That will be what was in the law, and there is a statutory instruments committee that makes sure that they are following it. And there's a cross-party committee that will say, you've done this, interpreted it in the correct way. So it's not just the government that decides.
Do you feel
it is the government
that it's the right policy? Is it the right policy?
I think that it is the right policy that we start to relook at how those winter fuel payments and the pension are made. I mean, to some extent, we should just be upping the pension so that people don't need winter fuel payments. The idea that pensioners are in so much poverty that they can't afford fuel payments, that we have to give them a special handout every winter, is wrong.
But that's
and we need
isn't
to
it?
change the way that our pension works.
The nightmare is you've got some very wealthy pensioners who don't need this but can still get it. But then if you go for means testing, that costs an absolute blooming fortune. Very difficult, isn't it?
Well, it is difficult, which is why the previous Conservative government always stayed with this, and we were accused of wanting to get rid of it falsely in elections and always kept it. And then this time round, this government in waiting didn't say it wanted to do this. So, again, that was pretty sneaky. And then they announced that they want to get rid of it. And I think they underestimate the real pressures on budgets for the people just above the benefit level. And there's many more of those than the rich people who don't really need this amount of money. And to do it at a time when you've just announced your wretched price controls mean that the price of energy has got to go up a lot in time for the winter is a double blow to pensioners.
We're going to come to energy and wind auctions and all the rest of it. But I wonder, John, it's sort of classic, isn't it? It's easy to give benefits, but it's very tough to take them away. It's rather like giving a dog a bone, isn't it? Once you've given it, getting it back is always deeply unpopular.
Well, not always deeply unpopular. I think it depends how you do it. I think if they'd come with a more sensible proposal linked to people's income. I mean, you could link it to the tax codes, for example, and say that if people are on the rate of tax on over 100,000 a year, then they clearly don't need this, for example. And
which we do for child benefit.
Which you do for that. You could have done that.
Yeah, you could.
And that would have probably met with the approval of both sides of the House of Commons.
That would have been my preference, but I think that the feeling was that the accounts needed to be presented in such an atrocious way that they had to do something that was very dramatic.
Well, that's the nonsense of this government. And look, it really bombed their popularity ratings. This was the most unpopular government with a majority we've ever seen anyway. It was a landslide on an unloved basis, with only 1/5 of all the voters actually wanting a Labour government enough to go and vote for one.
And a third of
and they've destroyed that vote already because they do just one thing after another to stop growth, damage enterprise, get in the way of prosperity, attack anybody who's got any get up and go and make some money and dares to save and invest, and then clobbers the pensioners on top. I mean, it's just dreadful.
I mean, pensions have risen far out beyond what wages have risen from when Gordon introduced it originally. We had
quite
huge
intentionally.
Yeah,
both
no, you're quite
governments
right.
want
We had
both-
huge.
both governments.
Yeah, that's quite right. And we had huge pensioner poverty beforehand. That doesn't exist in the same way now. So there are some arguments for reforming the system, but I do worry that we might have bitten off a bit more than people could chew.
Well, I think Labour's just got this one wrong, and I think a lot of your colleagues would quite like to have the opportunity to say that.
It's going to be a very...
They need a debate.
There's going to be a vote on this, it's pretty clear.
But there must be a debate, Nigel.
No, there'll be a debate and a vote.
And the opposition can, of course, order a debate, more or less any time.
I think it's going to be fascinating.